The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Not a phone call, not a knock at the door from a uniformed officer, just a letter, tucked between a water bill and a grocery store coupon. Margaret almost missed it. She almost set it on the kitchen counter with everything else and walked away to start dinner. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the handwriting, uneven, slightly slanted, like the words had been pressed into the page with great effort. Maybe it was the way her name was written. Not Mrs. Calloway, not Margaret Ann, but simply Mom. Just that one word, and somehow she already knew. She sat down right there on the linoleum floor of her kitchen, still in her coat, still holding her grocery bag. And she read every word her son had written from somewhere thousands of miles away. A son who had been trained to be fearless but had never quite managed to stop being the boy who used to fall asleep on her lap during thunderstorms. A son she had watched march into an airport in his uniform while she smiled and held herself together because he needed her to be strong. A son who had written her a letter she was never supposed to receive until it was too late. His name was Daniel, Danny to everyone who loved him. He had joined the army at 19, not out of anger, not out of desperation, but out of something deep and quiet inside him that he could never fully explain. He had tried once, sitting across from his mother at their kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he kept forgetting to drink. He told her he felt like the world needed people who were willing to stand between it and the worst things in it. She hadn't argued with him. She had simply reached across the table, placed her hand over his and said, "Then you be one of those people, but you come home." He had promised her he would. He had looked her in the eye and promised. The letter was dated 3 weeks before it arrived. He wrote about the quiet. That was the first thing that surprised her, that a soldier in a war zone would write about silence. But Danny described it in a way that made her chest ache. He wrote about the hours just before dawn when the whole world seemed to hold its breath, when he would lie awake and stare at the tent ceiling and think about home. He described the smell of her kitchen on Sunday mornings, butter melting in the pan, the specific sound the old coffee maker made when it finished brewing. He wrote about their dog, Chester, an old beagle who had started sleeping on Danny's side of the bed the week after he deployed. "Tell him I said to stop hogging my pillow," he had written. She laughed. She was crying, but she laughed. Then the letter shifted, and Margaret felt it before she read it. A change in the weight of the words, like the air pressure dropping before a storm. Danny wrote about a boy named Caleb, 20 years old, from a small town in Georgia, who carried a photograph of his little sister tucked inside his helmet. He had shown it to Danny one night during watch, the way soldiers share the things most precious to them, carefully, briefly, like holding out a lit match. The sister was maybe 8 years old in the photograph, gap-toothed and grinning, holding a fish she had caught at some lake. Caleb said she made him promise to take her fishing when he got home. He talked about her the way people talk about the things that keep them alive. Danny wrote that he had started to understand something out there, something he hadn't expected. He wrote that love was not soft. It was not candlelight and roses and all the gentle things people put on greeting cards. Love was Caleb, keeping that photograph in his helmet. Love was the men who had been out there for months, ground down and exhausted, and still got up every morning. Love was every parent who had ever watched a child walk into danger and somehow survived the watching. "I think I understand now, Mom," he wrote, "what it cost you to let me go. I don't have kids yet, and I already think I understand it. You loved me big enough to let me become who I needed to be. That's the bravest thing I've ever witnessed. Braver than anything I've done out here." Margaret had to stop reading for a moment. She set the letter down on the floor beside her and pressed both hands flat against the linoleum, like she needed to feel something solid. The grocery bag had tipped over. A can of soup had rolled under the cabinet. She didn't move to pick it up. She thought about the night before he left, how she had gone into his room after he fell asleep and stood in the doorway, just looking at him the way she used to when he was small. How she had memorized the shape of him in the dark. how she had gone back to her own room and prayed in a way she hadn't prayed since she was a child herself. Not formal, not composed, just raw and frightened and completely sincere. She picked the letter back up. Danny wrote about a mission. He didn't give details. She understood he couldn't. But he described a moment of stillness before it began, when the men around him went quiet in that particular way that meant something real was coming. He wrote that in that moment, with the dark pressing in from every side, he had thought about every person he loved and felt the full weight of them. His mother, his younger sister Lily, who had just started college and called him every Sunday night. His best friend from high school, Marco, who had cried at the airport and then punched Danny in the shoulder to cover it up. He felt all of them at once, he wrote, like a chorus, like something holding him up from the inside. If you're reading this before I get home, he wrote, and Margaret closed her eyes. If you're reading this before I get home, I need you to know that I was not alone when it mattered. I had good people around me. I was not afraid the way I thought I'd be afraid. I was thinking about you and not with sadness. I want you to understand that. With gratitude, with the kind of love that doesn't have words big enough to hold it. He wrote about what he wanted her to tell Lily, that she was the funniest person in the family and she should never let anyone make her smaller to make them comfortable. He wanted her to tell Marco that he owed him $20 from a bet they'd made in 10th grade and that debt died with him, so Marco could finally let it go. He wanted Chester to have extra treats. He was not above bribing a dog from beyond the grave, he wrote, and somehow that made her laugh and shatter at the same time. And then, near the end of the letter, Danny wrote something that she would return to for the rest of her life. He wrote, I've been thinking about what makes a life mean something. Out here you see it clearly. All the noise and distraction fall away, and you're left with the truth of things. And here's what I know, Mom. I know that love is the only thing we make that lasts, not the buildings, not the wars, not the names carved in stone, the love. The moment you held my hand crossing the street, the way you stayed up all night when I had a fever in 4th grade, the arguments and the apologies and the Sunday dinners, all of it is still happening somewhere in the fabric of what made me who I am. You did that. You built me. And even if I don't come home, that doesn't disappear. That lives. Margaret sat on the kitchen floor until it was fully dark outside. The house around her was quiet, the particular quiet of a space waiting for someone to return to it. Chester found her eventually, padding in from the hallway, and sat down heavily beside her the way old dogs do. She put her arm around him, and he didn't move. She thought about something her own mother had told her once, that the hardest part of loving anyone was accepting that they were never entirely yours to keep, that you could pour everything you had into a person and still, at the end of it, they would walk their own road. She had resented that idea when she was younger. Now she understood it was not a cruelty, it was the whole point. You loved them completely and you let them be whole. Danny came home 4 months later. It was not a Tuesday, it was a cold Saturday morning in March, and he walked through the airport in his uniform and looked older than she remembered, and she held on to him for a long time without speaking. He let her. He was a little thinner, quieter in a way that would take time to understand, and his hands shook sometimes when he was tired, something he would learn to manage slowly, with patience and with help. But he came home. Later that year at Thanksgiving, the family gathered around the table, Lily and Marco and Chester underneath stealing scraps, and Danny stood up without being asked. He said he didn't have a formal toast. He said he'd been trying to figure out how to say something he'd been carrying for a long time. He looked around the table at all of them, and his voice only broke a little when he said, I know what it's worth now. All of this, I know exactly what it's worth. No one asked him to explain. They understood. They lifted their glasses. Outside the window, the last of the autumn light was fading. Inside, the house was warm.